Good evening. I am going to digress from my usual format. I say some divrei Torah, try to share together that we should all grow from Chazal. But I wanted to take a few minutes as an exception to how we follow the format and speak about Moreinu v'Rabbeinu Harav Moshe Wolfson Zecher Tzadik v'Kadosh Levracha Zechuso Yogein Aleinu. He was nifter, and the Levaya was yesterday, but he was a typical shining Talmud of Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, and every one of his Talmidim in their lives, there was a striving for Chasidus, there was a striving for Shleimus in davening, and none of them were interested in money or covet. And you see it with everyone. Rav Pam, one of his Talmidim, Rabbi Friedman from Detroit, Rabbi Goldstein, all these names who became leaders in Klal Yisrael, that was the yesod, the foundation, and the backbone, the cementing factor of how they lived their lives and took from Rav Mendelovich this shining example. Rav Wolfson was born in America in 1924. When I came to Torah Vodaas in 1960, I was just 14 years old from Detroit. Rav Wolfson was then 36 years old. And he was a Rebbe in the elementary school of Torah Vodaas, first in first grade, then fifth grade. And at night, to supplement their income, he and Rav Vasilsky and others, well-known Rebbeim, came at night to learn with each one with a small group of Talmidim. Because these Talmidim were in the dormitory, they didn't have their families here, they were from out of town. So who was going to go over the Gemara with them at night? Who was going to spend an hour with them in reviewing what they had learned? And in my first day in Torah Vodaas, I was told that I'm to report to this and this room, which was a night class. And there were 8 boys in the group. Every group had 8 boys. And Rav Wolfson was the one to be the Rebbe of the group. Now, I saw right away that this was no average or normal Rebbe. I was just a young kid, but there was something unique about him that it just struck me. And I went to Rabbi Talansky, Olav Shalom, who was the administrator in the dormitory, because we used to eat by Balabatim Shabbos. That means there was a kitchen for the dormitory the whole week. But on Shabbos, we did not have a kitchen in the yeshiva that was open. So we were parceled out to different Balabatim. And I had a choshev, a wonderful Balabas, a Yerushalayim, and a wonderful Yid. But once I got into this learning class at night, after 2-3 weeks, I told Rabbi Talansky, I want to go eat one Shabbos by Rav Wolfson. And he said, no problem, I'll arrange it. And a week or 2 later, I was the guest of Rav Wolfson and his family. During the Suda, even though I eat in the Chassid, I daven and learn in the Chassidish Beis Medrash, but I never take Sharayim. But from that Shabbos, when I was just 14 and a half, and I was sitting next to Rav Wolfson, I took from his plate once or twice Sharayim, and I put it in my mouth, and I noticed that his 2 sons Avram Yitzchak and Herr Shmeilach, that they were smiling. They were like laughing that I was doing that. And they were 7, 8 years old, and I said to both of them, you're laughing today, but there will come a time that you will not laugh. Now, Avram Yitzchak went to live, when he got married, he moved to Square Town, and today he's a Rav in Square. And around 2 weeks ago, there was a chasna that we both attended. He was the Mesader Kedushin, he officiated at the wedding. And they were mechabed with reading the Ksuba. And when he finished the Siddur Kedushin, Rav Wolfson, the son of Rav Moshe Wolfson, he whispered to me before I began reading the Ksuba, he whispered to me, do you remember the Sharayim in our house that Shabbos you came to eat there? So I want to say to you that we learned a lot from Rav Wolfson. In 1962, 2 years after I came to Torah Vodaas, he lost his voice. So much so that he couldn't even whisper Shemona Esrei, and he had to stand next to the Bal Tefillah and be yoitza with his Shemona Esrei because he couldn't even whisper a word. And at the end, he learned a trade of how to fix washes. I went to the Rosh Yeshiva, I was Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky's Gabbai for 6 years. And I went into the Rosh Yeshiva and I said, Rav Wolfson, even though he was a youngster, he was 38 years old, but I saw already this was no regular Melamed. And I said to the Rosh Yeshiva that Rav Wolfson's going to become a watch repairman. And the Rosh Yeshiva said, well, what should we do? He lost his voice. I said, make him mashgiach. And the Rosh Yeshiva answered me and said, I'm going to discuss it with Rav Quinn, who was the menal of the Mesivta, and he was the menal there for 65 years. Zecher Tzadik v'Kadosh Levrocha. And 2 days later, Rav Wolfson became the mashgiach in the Beis HaMedrash. Now, I went over to Rav Wolfson that year that he was recovering. It was maybe like closer to a year later, and gaining back his voice, and asked him to give us a shir. I, as the Gabbai, had the right to designate a classroom at night. No one was using it, whatever. And Rav Traub, Zecher Tzadik Levrocha, who was a well-known Maggid Shir in the Mesivta, room 204, I said, yeah, we're going to have the shir there. I had a lot of misnagdim. People were against, you're taking a 5th grade teacher, and you're... But I asked him to give the shir, and 6 weeks later I asked him to give another shir. And then before Purim, Pesach, the first year was Toldos. But later, when it got closer to Purim, and I asked him to give again a shir, he said to me that I'm not a machine. And I said to him then, which maybe I was a little bit out of order, but I never regretted saying it to him, I said, Rav Wolfson, if you always talk about Min HaShamayim this, Min HaShamayim that, if Min HaShamayim you see that we are dovuk and we are close to you, then it's a siman that you have to be mashpia on us. And never again did he turn me down or give me a difficult time to say a shir. Now, this continued on. The shir never grew, as some like to describe it, that it was packed. It wasn't packed. The first year or two, I had to go to every boy and ask him to come to the shir. But as the quality disseminated, they saw who we were dealing with here. And the last 30 years of his life, he stopped going to chasnas because the oilam grew. He moved to, shortly thereafter, from Williamsburg to Borough Park. And he had, we moved from Williamsburg to Arvadas in 66, 67. Now, as I said, he was appointed mashgiach by Rav Yaakov. And when the yeshiva moved from Williamsburg to Borough Park to Flatbush, the Rosh Yeshiva, Zechrona Livrocha, moved to Muncie and had a house and a Beis Medrash in his house. He didn't want to make the move to Flatbush. And at that time, Rav Wolfson sent in a letter to the yeshiva that he was resigning and he wasn't going to Flatbush. Now, when I got word of that, I called, in those days, Rav Wolfson was very dovuk in the Skver Rebbe, that's the father of this Skver Rebbe, and he was nifter like in the same year that we moved, in 66, 67. I remember his Levaya very well. And he was a Kadosh Elyon, a Baal Ruach HaKodesh, and I called his Gabbai Shaya, and I told him that the Rav Wolfson is planning to leave Torah Vodas, and he signed a contract with Rav Binyamin Kamenetsky out in South Shore. Now, Rav Wolfson never drove, so he was prepared because he was worried about Parnassa. He was prepared to take 2 buses and a train to get there every single day, which means he would have been spending almost an hour and a half just in transportation one way. And the Gabbai told me that Rav Binyamin Willem had just called him a day earlier about the same thing, and he's going to go in and tell the Rebbe now. And I was sure that the Skver Rebbe was going to speak to him. I told to his Gabbai that the Hashpah, it's like we can't lose him. And there was one boy at that time that had a car in the dormitory. It's not like today that everyone had cars and cell phones. This was a rarity. It was a boy from Washington, D.C. His father was well-to-do. He was a lawyer. And he bought him a car, a Rambler. Many of you listening don't even know what a Rambler is. They stopped making them around 45 years ago. But he had a Rambler. He, Baruch Hashem, is alive. His name is Naftali Yaakov, Rav Naftali Yaakov Vogel, V-O-G-E-L. And I went straight to him after I got off the phone with the Shaya, and I said, I have a feeling that Rav Wolfson's going to come to you and ask you to drive him to Square Town. I don't want you to take any money from him. I will pay you for the trip. An hour and 15 minutes later, Rav Wolfson came over to Naftali Vogel, and he's alive. You can confirm the story. He lives on 41st Street. He's around 8 years older than I am, but we remain friends ad hayom hazeh. And he asked Naftali to drive him to Square Town. And he came into the Skver Rebbe, and the Skver Rebbe said to him, what's this that I hear, that you're leaving yeshiva? He said, well, I was appointed by Rav Yaakov, and Rav Yaakov's not going there, so I feel in fairness to the new Hanhola that I should resign and let them choose who they want. And the Skver Rebbe started banging on the table, nain, nain, nain. But I signed a contract already with them, nain, nain, nain. And Rav Wolfson remained in Torah Vodas, and his thousands of people who were inspired by him, uplifted by him, that he changed their lives. And even after he stopped going to chasnas and everything, he still came to every one of my children's tanoim, l'chaim. He never missed a simcha. And he once said to me, which I think was maybe a little bit of a compliment that I did not deserve, but he said, what I am today is because of you. And he never missed a simcha, and he was very, very close. There were some times that we had a different opinion on something. Most of the time I was makabel, and most of the time I deferred. He was my Rebbe, and I felt so close to him. Even before he went for his first time to Eretz Yisrael, he called me. He was in the summer. There was a Shabbos. He was in the Catskills. And he called me to come. He wanted to go over with me everything that he prepared as hachana. It was his first time to go to Eretz Yisrael. And he wanted to go over what he did as a preparation for that event. He touched so many lives. It's such a loss. Even though he was nifter at the age of 99. But he was still going fresh in his Shalosh and everything. I didn't daven with Rav Wolfson because when the Skolyer Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Levracha, moved into Borough Park in 1972, he sent 2 shluchim to my house that I should be the Rosh HaKohol. That's like president of a Hasidic shtibel. And I davened there. But when the Rebbe was nifter 7 years later in 1979, there was terrible machloikus in the Bais Medrash. And I went to Rav Wolfson and said, now I'm going to start davening in Emunas Yisrael. That's where my heart is. That's where my... And he said, Skolyer, the new Skolyer Rebbe, his grandson, needs you. Because it was very shaky, the Bais Medrash at that time. So I continued davening in Skolya, but when Emunas Yisrael, Rav Wolfson's Bais Medrash, built their new Bais Medrash, I bought the seat right next to him, and there was a Yid, a Choshev Yid, Harav Uri Shraga Spitzer, who sat in my seat. He asked me permission. And I said, gladly, as long as I'm not there, but if ever I come there or ever I start to daven, as long as we all agree that I purchased the seat. So he always spoke about Mashiach and about Emunah. And I was always sure he's going to be the first in line when Mashiach will come. But it didn't happen. And I know that when Mashiach will come, it'll be because now that he was nifter, and like the Zohar Kodesh says, that the power of someone who's a tzaddik, after they divest themselves from all the gashmias of the world, and the body is no longer together with the neshama, that they have even a greater power. And he wanted Mashiach so badly to come. Now that he was nifter, he's going to make it happen. Zachuso yogein oleinu. So I'm starting this year 20 minutes late. But I had to say something about Rav Wolfson. He did so much for Yidden and for Klal Yisrael. We couldn't just have him nifter and buried in Tveria, where his Rebbetzin was buried, and where the Talmidim of the Mizritcha Magid, they're buried there. He rightfully, deservedly was buried there today. As I said, Zechusa Yogein Aleinu. Now coming to Parshas Shelach, and Parsha Shelach has the infamous Meraglim, the story of the Meraglim. These were kulam anoshim. They were choshev. The word anoshim is only used by tzaddikim. And as Rashi says in the beginning, that they were wonderful Yidden. What happened? That they ended up schlepping us into the Midbar for 40 years because it was a day for each year. I'm sorry, a year for each day. That means they were spying out the land. They were sent, Shelach L'cha, and as everyone says, all the Meforshim, the Seporna, everyone, why does it say L'cha? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm not telling you to send these messengers. You could send them if you want L'cha. I'm not telling you to. And Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't happy about it either, but the people wanted to know and wanted. So at the end, he sent them. And they soured. And they came back saying the good, and then they said, Ephes. However, and when someone starts a conversation and says, oh, that guy is a terrific guy, but when that, however, that but comes, you should know, run away. Because who knows what he's going to say. Now, there's so many pshatim about the Medrash and about what tzaddikim said, what their kavanah was. But the Shelach HaKadosh has a different twist on the whole story. And the Shelach HaKadosh says that when the Meraglim said that it's an eretz, that it's ocheles yoshveha, that it's devouring, it's eating up its people. We came there, we saw one funeral after another. And he said that they're anshe midos. So the Shelach HaKadosh said, what do they mean? Anshe midos means that they were giants. They'll devour us. We won't be able to survive when we get in there. But the Shelach HaKadosh says, no, it wasn't talking about their height, that they were 6, 7, or 7 feet tall. He said, Anshe Midos Tovos, that's his lashon, that they were refined, good people, and that they were nice people. But the problem is, says the Shelach HaKadosh, that one of the tricks of the Yetzer Hara is that when someone is a Rasha, he makes him a nice guy. You know, we find many times Reform rabbis, maskilim, that they're doing terrible things, chil Shabbos, eating treif, and when we meet them or to talk to them, they seem like the nicest people. Would you like to may I get you a drink? May I bring you a chair? Speaks refined. Says the Shelach HaKadosh that this is one of the tricks, one of the ways that the Yetzer Hara drags a person in. And says the Shelach HaKadosh that when they came back, they were talking about how wonderful the people were, Anshe Midos. They were people with Midos Tovos. And this was to make the twist that when they started talking about the funerals and the other things, that they would cool them off and turn them against going in. Now, we know that these were tzaddikim. According to one pshat, they said, like the Chidushi Arim talks about, that we are in the Midbar. We're living a heavenly life. We are drinking water from a be'er, a well, that when we move to the next encampment, the well moves with us. We walk out in the morning and there is fresh bread, the delicious mun that came down and tasted however the person wanted it to taste. Their clothes did not wear out. When the pasuk says simlascha lo volsa me'alecha, that your clothes they grew with the people, they were washed every day from the cloud, they were ironed, they were starched, they smelled as fresh as could be, and this was every day. So they tined what their kavanah was. We have to discourage the people from wanting to go. And if we can discourage the people from wanting to go, that is how we will be able to convince them not to go into Eretz Yisrael. Don't forget the problem was that Hashem said to go into Eretz Yisrael. And one of the pshatim say that when they said, Ki chazak hu mimenu, that they're much more mightier than us, that there was a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They said, Ki chazak hu, that these people in Eretz Yisrael are stronger mimenu than even HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That with HaKadosh Baruch Hu with us, we will not to be able to stand up to them, against them, or in any which way. So there was a very, very big kitrug in them going into Eretz Yisrael. And you see that the punishment, as a matter of fact, the Mefarshim ask, they came back and they talked Lashon Hara. But they only spoke Lashon Hara for the first day, or maybe only the first hour. They didn't have 40 days of bad-mouthing Eretz Yisrael. They had 40 days. So why should we have a year for each day and we had to stay in the Midbar 40 years? We should have just stayed 1 year as a punishment for the 1 day that we spoke Lashon Hara, because that's what the problem was. As it says in Medrash, that how did they all die? Their tongues went straight into their belly button. And that's how they died. It was a miserable death. It was a misa meshuna, because they talked with their tongue and what they did. But why would they be obligated to suffer and to be put on the bad list for 40 years against 40 days? They didn't speak 40 days Lashon Hara, and they answer and say that the reason that they were punished for the time, the 39 days that they were there without speaking Lashon Hara, is because their perspective and their view was already being molded and shaped to speak bad about Eretz Yisrael. So they paid for that too, because they were with a negativity in how their attitude to Eretz Yisrael was. Now, when they left, they knew, as Chazal says, the Medrash, the Gemara says, they knew that when they are going to come in to Eretz Yisrael and spy out the land, that their positions, because these were all Kula Manoshim, and look at what the Sapurna and the others all talk about, that they were one in charge of 100 Yid, in charge of 1,000. These were big people. But they knew that when they would be in Eretz Yisrael, they would lose their jobs. Because this whole activity of what they did in that capacity would not be needed in Eretz Yisrael. The mistake they made was Number one, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to go in. Is there a question after that? And the second thing was that they missed the point that yes, the desert was holier and more heavenly and spiritual and everything, how they lived and everything. But they missed the point that a Yid comes down to this world not to sit back and relax and live a heavenly life. You have to live heavenly on this earth. And there's then a mission of transforming the physicality and the earthliness of this world in turning it into even higher of the regular heavenly to a higher level of heavenliness. And that is the tafkid of each and every Yid. And that's why all the mitzvahs that we do, when we take a lulav or we take leather and we make tefillin and we have parchment and a sefer Torah, that is part of the theme of this world, to take the physical items, the skins, the shofar from the animal, the foods, the matzah that we take from the flour, from the ground, and to turn it into ruchnius. And that's higher than just taking ruchnius and being in ruchnius and staying in ruchnius, to come into the earthliness and transform it into the complete ruchnius. So they missed that message. That's what many of the Meforshim say. And the negativity was the underscoring thing of why they had to be 40 years. Because when they left Egypt and they went across the Yam, the journey was only 11 days to get into Eretz Yisrael from leaving Egypt. And here they spent 40 years crisscrossing up and down, back and forth for 40 years. And even that, they were granted pure miracle, because when they went in that area, and if you travel from Yerushalayim down to the area of the Yam Suf, you find that traveling along, there are signs. This is Midbar Paran, this is Midbar Tzin, and there's tremendous hills. So the Medrash says that when they came to a point and there was a hill, it flattened for them. So they lived an unbelievable, miraculous life till they even came into Eretz Yisrael. And the lesson is that with all the miracles that we can see around ourselves, don't forget, these Yidden, when the story of the Meraglim happened, they were just, it was, I mean, the Mefarshim say, why is the story of Miriam becoming a tsarua in our parsha, and then immediately we talk about the Meraglim, because the Meraglim saw what happened to her with the Lashon Hara and they didn't learn from it. And that's why it's put right there. But this wasn't a story that happened years later or something like that. It was something that happened, and while they were still enjoying all the miracles, they still didn't listen, because the parsha says, when they came back and they were then told that they're going to have to remain 40 years in the Midbar. So the Pasuk says there's a story with the Mapilim, that there was a big group that came to Moshe Rabbeinu and said to him, we sinned. This whole business that we cried out, we know the Meraglim came back on Tisha B'Av, And they were crying when they heard from the Meraglim how bad it was in Eretz Yisrael. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu called out and said, you cried a crying for nothing. And I'm going to give you on this date what to cry about. And both Batei Migdash were destroyed on Tisha B'Av. So it remained for generations. We know that when Mashiach will come, as the Navi Zechariah said, every fast day will turn into a miracle, will turn into a Yom Tiv. It'll turn into a Yom Tov, and that's what its essence is. That's why we don't say Tachnun on Tisha B'Av. I mean, Tisha B'Av is a fast day, and it's a day of mourning. It's Avelis. We sit on the ground, we take off our shoes, and it's not like Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a Yom Tov. It's not a day of Avelis. We take off our shoes, like I've told you a few times, because of the money that the Shvatim got for selling Yosef, and they bought shoes. And for us, Yom Kippur is still a day of kapara for those shoes. And that's why we don't wear shoes. But nothing to do with Avelis, like somebody who's sitting Shiva, lo aleinu, lo aleichem. If they're sitting Shiva or it's Tisha B'Av, that's real Avelis. And that's why we don't say Tachnun. Because in Eicha, Yirmiyahu, and I said, by the way, that Yirmiyahu wrote Rus. It was a mistake. I realized as soon as I finished the shir, it was Shmuel HaNavi. But Yirmiyahu wrote Eicha, and he said, Kara Lai Moyed, that it's a Yom Tiv, and we don't say any Tachnun. So in its source, in its root, it's a Yom Tiv. Temporarily, from the Churban till Mashiach, we have a day of mourning. But we will come to a point that it'll be a total Yom Tov, and we'll be able to rejoice, and we'll be able to do a lot of things that we're not doing now. Now, these Mapilim, what happened? They came to Moshe Rabbeinu and said, Moshe, our Rebbe, we realized we sinned. And we are going to now go up to Eretz Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, don't you dare do it, because Hashem's telling me that the Aron is not going to go with you. And without the Aron, meaning the Shechina, HaKadosh Baruch, you're not going to succeed. You're going to be unsuccessful. Excuse me. But they insisted. Excuse me. Vayapilu lalos lahara. They insisted. They were adamant. That's what the word Vayapilu means. And they're called the Mapilim, that group that insisted even after Moshe Rabbeinu told them, don't you dare do it. Hashem is not with you. And they insisted, and they said, we sinned, and we're going to show our sincerity that we realized we sinned, and we're going to go ahead and go. They went out, and shortly thereafter, Amalek and Kanani came down from their mountain and killed every single one of them. Not one survived. Now, the question is asked, we know there's a rule of doing tshuva. I mean, they obviously repented. So why did they have such a miserable death? Why wasn't their tshuva accepted? Okay, you made a mistake, you realize it, you're crying, you're clapping al chet, you're doing whatever you have to do. But it was not until they realized that it's not going. Moshe Rabbeinu is not backing off and says, okay, you did tshuva, you felt bad, fine, tshuva helps, always. The problem over here is that once he told them, Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not maskim to you trying to go now. They didn't learn. Hashem told them to go to Eretz Yisrael, and they were crying with the Meraglim when they got done. They told off Moshe Rabbeinu, let's appoint someone and return back to Mitzrayim. We were better off there than what we're destined for over here. And the way they spoke, that we know tshuva helps, but it says that if someone says echtevi oshuv, that I want to do the avera, but I'm going to do tshuva, don't worry. And tshuva is always accepted, so I'll do the tshuva, even though I know that I'm doing the avera now, but I'm planning right after the avera to do the tshuva. So that, it says in the Gemara, echtev oshuv, I will sin and then do tshuva, that he is not ein maspikim biyodo lasos tshuva. He's never in his lifetime given the opportunity to do tshuva. So tshuva doesn't always help. Under most cases, it does. But here they were getting a direct sivui from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I mean, we sometimes wonder what would the HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to do in this situation. We don't have Moshe Rabbeinu, we go to tzaddikim who have Ruach HaKodesh, and they can guide us and lead us and tell us what to do and what not to do. But these people were being told directly, and they still did, and then they wanted to do tshuva, and they wanted, no matter what, to do the tshuva and show that they're going to Eretz Yisrael, but they did not end up going, and they were killed on the way. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that Moshe Rabbeinu had to remain Eivir LaYarden, because there were 36,000 Yidden that left Mitzrayim early, and they were also early and killed right away in the desert, in the Midbar. And these Yidden, the Mapilim, so it says in Sifrei Kabbalah that all those neshamas had, by Tchias HaMesim, to be able to get up and go, they needed a tzaddik to latch onto. That we know there were many tzaddikim who told their chasidim that they want to be buried in Chutz La'aretz. Because it says that if there's a tzaddik in a cemetery, no matter how big the Russia was when it comes to Tchias HaMesim, according to some opinions, the Arizal does not agree with this. He says only the Tikkun Achron, if a guy was a Gilgal 10 times, so if in the last time he fixed up what he had to do, he gets up by Tchias HaMesim. But there were other tzaddikim who said no, Kilo Yidach Mimenu Nidach, that every Yid will stand up by Tchias HaMesim. But to propel them to Eretz Yisrael, they have to latch onto a tzaddik. So there were many tzaddikim who said, b'dafka, they don't want to be taken to Eretz Yisrael. They want to be buried in the city where they are nifter, because there is a cemetery there that needs their help when it comes to Tchias HaMesim. Now, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu, he smelled, he knew there was something wrong, and Yeshua's name, as the parsha says, was Hoshea bin Nun. And Moshe Rabbeinu took a yud that was floating in the air from Sarah Imenu, because remember her name was Sarai, but Hashem took away that yud and put a hey in, so her name became Sarah. Now that Yud, the Medrash says, was floating around and was never attached for 17 years. In Shemayim, and then it went into a different mode of where it was waiting. But when it came time to have the Meraglim go, Moshe Rabbeinu was worried about Yehoshua that he would fall in. And he said, with the Yud on, it's Yud Hey, the first two letters then, Ka Hoshiacha Meyatzas Merabim, that may you be saved from the Eitzah of the Meraglim. Now there's a question. There were two that didn't go along. There was Yoshua and there was Kolev. Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu daven for Kolev also? So some say, some Meforshim, that the Maisa Ha'egel, the golden calf, Yehoshua, who was the Meshores, the servant of Moshe Rabbeinu, his Talmud, his servant, he waited at the bottom of the mountain, and all the other Klal Yisrael were not at the bottom of the mountain, they stayed away. So that's how they fell into the Egel. But all 11 of the Shivtei Korah who became Meraglim, who ended up going in, they were Oimed ben Nisayan. They did not fall in and serve and participate in the Maisa Ha'egel. But Yehoshua, that was at the bottom of the mountain and he wasn't there by the Maisa Ha'egel, didn't have the schos of not doing it. That Kolev was there, and so were the other 10 who ended up Nebuch Rishoyim. But then they were tzaddikim and they didn't fall into the story of the Egel. So they had a schus, and Kolev was part of them that didn't fall in. So Moshe Rabbeinu didn't daven for him, but he davened for Yoshua, and he added a Yud to his name that came from Sorah. Now we have a few Yudin, the letter Yud, that is extra throughout Tanakh. 3-4 places there's an extra Yud. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu take and want the Yud from Sorah that had been part of Sarah's etzem, ingredients etched into the essence of her very being, and not take a Yud from somewhere else? And the Meforshim explain that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted the power of Sarah to go into Yoshua. Because Sarah said, Lo yirash zeh, Yishmael will not inherit, im beni im Yitzchak, with my son Yitzchak. He will have nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. Don't forget, all the Arabs come from Yishmael. All the Christians, lahavdil, come from Esav. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted the power of Sarah Imenu, who took a stand. Now, her whole life, as the Medrash says and Chazal say, she was quiet and the back seat behind Avram. He led the charge to make Gerim and to make Yidden and do what he did. And she cooperated. And she was part and parcel of every mitzvah. But she was not the leader in leading the flock like Avram Avinu. But we find there's an exception. When she felt that Ishmael was a bad influence for her son, She took a stand and wanted them out of the house. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Avram, Kol asher yomar elecha Sarah, shema bekola, you listen to her. And she took an unusual step of adamantly demanding that Yishmael and Hagar leave the house. When it came that time for her to go back, she went back, but when it came to throw her out, they threw her out with Yishmael, Hagar and Yishmael. So the power to take a stand when you see that your family or your Talmidim or your community are losing their stronghold in their Yiddishkeit because of the influences of their friends, their neighbors, you have to get out of the situation. And that's when Sarah stepped up to the plate and demanded that they go. And the second demand was Lo yiraj ze im b'ni im Yitzchak, Eretz Yisrael will never be theirs. And those two things of having the backbone to take a stand and to appreciate what Eretz Yisrael is came from that yud of Sarah, that now part of Sarah became part of Yehoshua. And that's why he led the people into Eretz Yisrael and understood that every single blade of grass was Kodesh Kadoshim. Now, and that's why they say, I mean, the mission really was a strategic mission, that they went to spy out Eretz Yisrael to find out where the people are, where their armies are, what are the mountains and what's in the mountains, to spy out, to be able to take over Eretz Yisrael. Why was there this talk of look at the fruits and look at the quality of the trees and I mean, that wasn't their mission to know how the grapes were or how the cherries were. But that was part of the mission to etch into the essence of Klal Yisrael that every blade of grass and every cherry is unbelievably kodesh. That the chavivas of Eretz Yisrael, to be able to seep into their hearts and their mindset and their neshamas, came from that mission that they were accomplishing by going, and they went in as tzaddikim. The problem was when they got out of there, just like the Medrash says about Lot. When Lot went down to Mitzrayim with Avram, he was a tzaddik Omer, the Medrash says. What happened? The 90 days that Avram was in Mitzrayim before he went back to Eretz Yisrael, Lot was with him and he hung around 42nd Street. And he gathered up to his neck all the schmutz and all the taivas and all the immorality. And that's how he ended up in Sodom, because that's where you had the headquarters of immorality. So Yehoshua was fully prepared. And he needed the strengthening because he didn't have the schus of not participating in the Egel. Like I said, he was at the bottom of the mountain. He wasn't with the people when they were doing the Egel. Now, we find in the Haftorah of this week that there's an interesting change that we have, that Yehoshua sent out 2 spies and their names are never ever mentioned. The Medrash tells us who they were. That was Pinchas and Kalev. And they ended up successful in their mission. And because their names are not mentioned, it's a message to us that they weren't looking for themselves. The Meraglim, when they got into Eretz Yisrael, it was already, this is what we have to go start working a field to get a piece of bread? And we're losing our positions? Is this worth it? But when Kalev and Pinchas went to Chazal, say, they didn't have an iota, a mashahu of interest in what they will be, what will they gain, what will their status be, what kind of job will they have. Nothing ever made the difference. And that's why even their names are not mentioned. They didn't want any recognition. And at the end of the story, another teretz why Moshe Rabbeinu did not daven for Kalev was because at the end, Kalev married Miriam. And when you have a wife such a tzaddikus, she puts a boundary around you to save you from Avera and Chet. And that's the reason that he didn't worry about Kalev. Because married to Miriam, he's never going to fall in. Yehoshua, we know that when Kalev and Pinchas were saved, they were saved by Rochav Hazoina. She was a woman of ill repute. And at the end, Yehoshua, when they came back and saved Yericho and they came into Israel, she was Megayer, because she was so moved by the Mesiras Nefesh of these two that it caused her to be Megayer, and at the end, Yehoshua married her and had 2 daughters, no sons, but from these 2 daughters came out 8, the Gemara says, 8 Kohanim Gedolim, that 8 Kohen Gadol, Kohanim Gedolim, came out from them. That's the level of holiness that she brought into her life, from being at such a level of negativity that she was able to grow a message to every person that never give up. Because look at Rochav, and look who she married, and look what came from her. So we have an endless opportunity to bring out the best in ourselves. And we should always be imbued, and we should always be inspired, and we should always be able to rise up to the equation. The Baal Shem Tov said, "V'hischazaktem u'lekachtem mepri haaretz," that the kasha that I just asked, they were not worried about the fruit. They wanted to know strategy. But the Baal Shem Tov says, why was chizik for mipri haaretz, for the cherries and the figs and everything that they saw there? Because you need chizuk when you come into Eretz Yisrael, like I said, and it's a vort from the Baal Shem Tov, to appreciate every blade of grass, kodesh kadoshim. So we should be zoicha to be able to have the benefits and the growth of all of the goodness from our efforts to appreciate every mitzvah, every schus that we have, every golden opportunity. And when we step foot into Eretz Yisrael, to realize that this is the pinnacle, the turret of Kedusha of Klal Yisrael and the world.